All right, so do you have any questions before we get started?
Um, is there anything specific that you want me to talk about at all?
So I have a couple questions to ask, but if there's anything at the end that you think that I missed or that you want to plug coming up, feel free to, I'll ask that question at the end like I do with all of my interviews. Hey, is there anything else that we didn't cover or that you want to focus on once the interview does come out? If there's anything that you think that I missed about your story or that you wanted to talk about, that you wanted to dive deeper into, please tell me at the end and we'll go down that path.
All right, perfect. Also, I was telling you worked for the Black Bears, right?
Yeah, in
Yeah,
2016. I was looking at
I
your
remember.
LinkedIn.
I also worked for the Black Bear.
I know when Joe was like, I think I have a really good next guest for you. She says that she worked with you at the Black Bears. And I was like,
I remember. I saw you on
"Dude."
his story, and I was like, I remember her.
Oh my gosh, that was like a freaking lifetime ago, it feels like. But like you have accomplished so much since then, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Thanks.
So let's just get started. I was looking at your LinkedIn, and prior to that Black Bears internship, you hadn't done really anything in sports. Was that your first experience with the atmosphere around sports, even though what you're doing now is vastly different from that internship?
Yeah, so that was my first time kind of working in athletics. I am from Clarksburg, West Virginia. It's very small. I went to Notre Dame High School, also very small. And kind of the atmosphere there is you play a lot of sports. So the school can have sports teams. So my almost my whole life, I played four sports, loved athletics, loved being around athletics, but never really had the opportunity to work in athletics. And at that point, that was my freshman year of college, the Black Bears internship, like the summer after my freshman year.
Yeah, mine as
And
well.
yeah, and I knew that I wanted to work in athletics, but I was like, there's like not really a lot that I can be doing specifically in sports psychology right now. Um, so let me just try to find something that is in sports so I can learn as much about the entire industry as I can. So that was kind of what started me there.
And then from there, you kind of took a break a little bit with your bachelor's degree, which is in psychology and is in history, but not once again not specific to sports. So while you were there, were you looking for more sports opportunities, or was the Black Bears kind of supposed to be a little one-off situation that ended up blossoming into what you want to do for the rest of your life?
Yeah, so while I was at St. Mary's, so St. Mary's is a very small liberal arts college. And so the majors are very kind of like, I don't want to say bare minimum, but like we have the basics and we don't really have anything like out of the ordinary. So at WVU, there's like a sports psychology major, but at St. Mary's, it's just psychology and you kind of like make it work where you want to. So for a couple years, I kind of was just like researching sports psychology, kind of focusing on school. And then I added on the history major. I specifically went into women's history just because it was something that always interested me and kind of along the way found ways that psychology and women's history like really mesh together. And that was really fun for me. And I think it was my sophomore or junior year, I started working for the Notre Dame football team. And that was like kind of like my next job that was very like sport specific, sport related. And I really think the Black Bears job really helped me get that one. So that was fun for me.
So then what at what point did you say to yourself, okay, I need continued education. I need to get my master's somewhere. And how did you end up at Springfield?
Yeah, so it's actually funny story how I ended up at Springfield. Because like I've been saying, I've always had an interest in sports psychology specifically. And because at St. Mary's, it was very like just the basics of psychology. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to get a job in the sports psychology field with just this like baseline, really great education, but not really specific in sports psychology. I just felt as though there was a lot more that I had to learn, specifically with the realm of athletes. And so the way I found Springfield, because Springfield, my whole theme of my life is just like tiny schools. Springfield is a pretty small school, very well known for its kind of athletic type majors. And I found it through, have you heard of Dr. Jonathan Bader?
No.
So he's a sports psychologist. I believe he worked for the Mets, and I read his book at the time. I was a senior in college at St. Mary's, and I was reading his book. I thought it was so interesting, and I had reached out to him via email on his website. And I'm assuming he gets a lot of emails because he didn't reply to the first one. So I was like, that's okay, like that's fine. And he had a TED Talk, and he, in his TED Talk, freestyle rapped. He was kind of talking about pressure and anxiety, and he freestyle rapped during his TED Talk. And I was like, I really want to talk to this man. I really need to figure out a way that I can get to talk to him. So I wrote a rap and I sent it to him. It was basically within it, like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to do what you do. I would love to talk to you. I want to pick your brain a little bit, but like in a rap. And I sent it to him. And then I got a reply. So I was very excited. And I didn't get a reply specifically from him, but it was from his assistant, I believe. And he was like, we loved your rap, like, would love to talk to you. So kind of we started this email relationship. And I was like, I really want to go to grad school. I want to get my master's. Do you have any recommendations of places I should go? And he gave me like the usual schools that I had already known about. WVU was certainly on the list. And then Springfield College was on there. And I was like, never even heard of Springfield College. Like, what is this place? So I kind of researched it. And Springfield offers sports psychology as well as athletic counseling, which on the surface level are incredibly similar. The question is all the time, like, what is the difference between these two things? And that was something for me that I had to figure out. I was like, oh, which one do I want to apply to? So I chose athletic counseling because it's the only athletic counseling program in the country. And it really takes a more holistic, whole athlete approach to sports psychology. Whereas I would say the sports psychology program is very much focused on performance exclusively. Whereas athletic counseling is, I absolutely care about your performance. I want you to perform the best that you can, but also acknowledging that there's so many other parts of the athlete that goes into that performance. So learning about that as well.
And how did you end up at athletic counseling versus a sports psychology type specific master's degree?
Yeah, so for me, I'm very passionate about mental health. And I just felt as though there was a really big emphasis on that in the athletic counseling program. And not that there wasn't in sports psychology, but just the idea of in the athletic counseling program, I took a lot of counseling classes. So I was in classes with clinical mental health counselors, rehab counselors. So having that counseling background was really appealing to me because I think you do so much of that in sports psychology, whereas traditional sports psychology programs don't give you as much counseling work as this program did.
Yeah, I was talking to Joe through the entirety of his time at Springfield, and he was just telling me how involved with the athletic department he was, and then how amazing the hands-on experiences that he was having were. And then I looked at your LinkedIn, and you helped out with 6 different teams at Springfield, or 5 different teams at Springfield. How did
Yeah.
each of those differ in the way that you approached them, especially the ones like football and men's golf and gymnastics that were specific to men and that you couldn't really on a personal level empathize with?
Yeah, it was very different experience for me. I went from St. Mary's, which is a women's college, so being around women all the time, to at Springfield working mainly with men's teams, where I was kind of for a moment out of my element. I was like, I don't know how these I'm going to relate to these guys. Like, I don't know how they're going to approach me, how they're going to perceive me, especially in like the more traditionally like tougher sports like wrestling and football. But I found it to be so rewarding and really pushed me out of my element in those spaces because I haven't been around those kinds of environments. So figuring out, okay, how do I approach this? How do I make me seem like a comfortable person to come to in this environment? Because that's really most of what athletic counseling is trying to make the athletes feel really comfortable around you, feel like they can come to you with things, they can trust you, building those bonds. So it was definitely a learning curve, figuring out where do I fit in these spaces. And as opposed to, I didn't get to really work with a lot of women's teams until kind of the end of my second year. I got in more with, I worked with the softball program, I worked with some female track athletes. And once I was working with those female track athletes, I was like, wait a second, I need to like shift gears again. Like I was so used to being in these female environments. And for like this year and a half, I've just solely been like in wrestling rooms, on football fields. So figuring out where do those shifts come and how do you portray yourself to people?
How did you do that? And why was it such a stark difference once you started working with women's teams again?
Yeah, so I would say for the men's teams, I found the best way to relate to them is to just be there. For me, I don't know if you've ever been in a wrestling room. They're very hot, they're very sweaty, they don't smell great. Um, but I really went out of my way to be like, all right, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be at practice. I'm going to be with them. And I found a lot of times that was just the most effective method, just being around, just being there and showing them like, hey, I really care about what you're doing. Whenever there's a free moment, asking them, obviously I'm not a wrestling expert, being like, hey, I noticed you were working on this. Can you kind of explain that to me? I would say for the guys, it's just really showing them like, I care about what you're doing and I really want to learn more about it. And kind of something that we went by that I learned at Springfield is like the athlete is the expert on themselves. So let them be the expert and really teach you about themselves. And I found that was the most effective method for me with the guys. Whereas with the women, I would say my approach was much more myself, if that makes sense. Not that I wasn't being myself with the guys, but I found it much more easier to relate to the women. I could just kind of like be my authentic self. I grew up around sports. I kind of know how women's sports works. So I would say it was just much more of me feeling less like I had to like present a certain thing and just being more comfortable and like, this is who I am and letting them relate to me on that level.
So let's get back to the working among men and the sports and the inherent issues that men's sports deal with.
Mm-hmm.
What was the process of assimilating into that environment for you because you simply were not relating in the way that you would with women's sports inherently?
Yeah, so it was definitely a little difficult at first, just kind of feeling like very out of my element, being like, "Ooh, am I allowed to be here? Like, am I bothering them? Do they not want me around?" And I would say that's a line that really in the athletic counseling program, I was much more aware of it. Whereas I would say a more traditional sports psychology program, like you were seen as a coach. So like you're kind of in there, you're talking about things, at least in my experience, what I've seen. Whereas with athletic counseling, in my head, I wasn't a coach, I was their counselor. So figuring out what is and is not appropriate as a counselor. So I would check in with my athletes that I met with individually and I would be like, hey, I'm going to go to practice today. Is that comfortable for you? Do you want to talk to me? If you don't want to talk to me at practice, that's okay. Um, any athlete I met with individually, we would go through an informed consent form. And I'd be like, okay, like this is a small campus. You're going to see me around. If you don't want to talk to me, I will not be offended. Like, I'm going to kind of gauge how you feel about that. So I would say with the men, it was a lot more of me kind of like just checking in and being like, is this comfortable for you? How is this going? Is there anything you want to be changed? And in the practice environments, especially, the more I went, the more comfortable I was. But there was that first like month where I would just kind of like stand in the corner in the wrestling room and be like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. Like, I don't know if they want me here. And it was really talking with coaches too and being like, where should I be? Like what should I be doing? What do you want? So I would say for me, the biggest thing was just communicating with people and being like, this is what I'm doing right now. Is this working? Do you want me to change it? And I think that for me has been the best approach. And whenever you know somebody wants you to be somewhere or wants you to be doing a certain thing, you're more confident in what you're doing.
Of course. And then I wanted to ask you, so you were working with wrestling, you were also working with men's gymnastics. What was
Yes.
the dynamic around body dysmorphia and eating disorders? Because those are two of the sports that most athletes that have eating disorders that struggle with any kind of disordered eating tend to come from. Did you
Yeah.
see that at Springfield, or was that kind of a non-issue with the population that you worked with?
So I would say it wasn't in the athletes that I specifically worked with, because the way that we do it is there were a few athletic counselors per team. So I would say on a 50-person roster, I would have like 6 athletes that were assigned to me specifically. So with the athletes that I specifically worked with, I didn't see it as a like glaring issue, but certainly was present. I would say for the wrestling team, it was all about the weight cut. So it'd be checking in every week, like, how much weight do you have to cut this week? How can we make sure you're doing it in the healthiest way possible? And for the athletes I worked with, it was all about like time management, being like, okay, you have this much weight to lose, you have this much time to do it. How are we going to do that the most effective way, the healthiest way? Because when you're doing it healthy, you're going to perform better. So, kind of like, I took that approach with them. Whereas, like, if you're trying to lose 10 pounds in a day, how well do you think you're going to perform out on the wrestling mat? Or how well do you think you're going to perform in a meet? Um, so, I would say that was the biggest thing. It was certainly underlying, but for the athletes I specifically worked with, it wasn't the biggest issue that they faced. But you would certainly see it, you would hear about it. And so whenever you had those moments with the whole team, you were just kind of emphasizing them to them, those things that play into those things. So like, hey, let's make sure we're managing our time well, or let's make sure we're managing our emotions well, and just making sure, like, just so you guys know I'm here, like just making yourself available.
Along with that eating disorder wrestler gymnast pipeline, what other questions did you ask the other athletes from the other sports that you worked with that were sports specific?
Yeah, so I always would be like, what do you think is the biggest thing that's preventing you from playing your best? And I would say it could be anything. It could be, for a softball player, it could be, oh, the way I'm pitching, or the way that I'm throwing, or those kinds of things. Or it could be, I'm doing really poorly in school and it's really kind of, I'm not focused. I would say focus was a big thing that I worked on with a lot of my athletes, and just trying to figure out, how can I be present when I have all this other stuff going on? So that's why I say the majority of the time I wasn't talking about sports specific issues with my athletes. It was more of, hey, this thing that's going on in my life is really kind of distracting me. I'm not focused. I'm not able to practice the way I want to. So let's figure out how we can handle this. And then that's going to lead into your performance.
From what I know, from what Joe has said about the Springfield curriculum, it's incredibly applied.
Mhm.
What kind of clinical work experience do you have, and did that curriculum give you, if any?
Yeah, so as far as clinical experience, every team I worked with, we would do like whole team workshops. So we would work with them if we would kind of take assessments from the coaches, from the athletes, being like, what are the big mental skills that you want to work on? And I would say that's where the majority of like my mental skills work came in, was on those big group things. So we're working on focus, we're working on handling pressure. Whereas I would meet with several athletes once a week, once every couple weeks. And that was where more of the one on one individualized work came in. And I did that with every sport that I worked with, both Springfield teams and non Springfield teams. And once COVID came around, all on Zoom, which was definitely something interesting to navigate. But I would say the Springfield program gave me an insane amount of applied clinical work. Um, for CMPC, you need like 400 hours of applied work, and it is uncommon to leave the Springfield program not having all 400 hours.
Wow. Was there ever, as you were getting through this master's program, an athlete that you worked with or something that you said to an athlete that you really saw a breakthrough in them that made you say, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the right place, doing exactly what I should be doing"?
Yes. So, without being specific, there was an athlete I worked with my entire time at Springfield. And I remember we had had a session, and I personally was like, I don't know if like what we're talking about is working, if what we're doing is beneficial. And I feel like every person kind of has those moments where it's like, oh, like, am I even helping this person? Like, you just want to help so badly. And if they're not giving you a lot, it's kind of hard to know. So we had had a session, and they had emailed me after their competition. They were like, I just want you to know that like what we talked about really helped. I really tried to apply it, and they did really well, like the best they had done all season. And I was just like, you couldn't tell me anything that day. I was like, this is the best day of my life. Like, I really feel like I helped this person. Um, and I always think the hardest part of counseling, like having these counseling type relationships, is once you move on, you like don't get to know how it goes. You're kind of just like, it's the ultimate cliffhanger. So my last session with this athlete, I was like, I just want you to know, like, I really feel like you made me a better counselor. Like, you really made an impact on my life, and you helped me learn so much. And they had like given me the same sentiment. They're like, I don't know how I would have, blah, blah, blah. And it was the best. And I adore this person. And um it just is really exciting. Anytime I'm like feeling down, I'm like, remember that email? Like, that really helped.
You need to like print it out and put it on your wall in a
I
frame.
should. I should. But anytime an athlete kind of like gives you that feedback, or I would check in a lot. I'd be like, hey, is what we're doing working? Like, is this helping you? Because I made it no secret. I was like, I'm a student, I'm learning. Like, let's learn together. I want to help you. But if what we're doing isn't helping, tell me. So, kind of those check in moments were always really helpful for me. And just hearing their feedback. And if it was positive, awesome. And if they were like, actually, I really would like to start focusing on this more, that made me feel really good too. Because I was like, they were comfortable enough to tell me that. So
For
that
sure.
any kind of like reception from an athlete always made me feel really excited.
So, what got you passionate in the very beginning about athlete mental health, and has your trajectory since that moment been kind of on track?
Yeah, so I was a very interesting child. I figured out very quickly that I loved psychology. I really don't know what like started it initially, but ever since I can remember, I was like, I want to be a psychologist. Like, I want to talk to people. And in my vision, it was like me sitting in a chair, like them laying on the couch. Like, that was my vision. But I also really wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. Like, very much wanted to be a pitcher for the Pirates. That was my goal. Quickly realized that that probably wasn't going to happen for me. Maybe it'll happen for somebody one day, not me. So for me, it was kind of learning that those two things don't have to be exclusive. Like, I loved sports. I always played sports. I always loved psychology. And one day I was like, these two things like can go together. And I think just being like a sports fan and an athlete myself, realizing, hey, like, what if there were a psychologist here, or a therapist here that could talk to this person about like the slump they're in, or talk to them about their bad game that they had. And so as a young child, I was kind of like, oh, I really want to do that. I really think I can do that. Um, so after that, it was just like researching like crazy, like reading all the articles I could read, reading all the books I could read, and kind of figuring out like, is this possible? Like, is this a thing that I can do? Because I would say, like, whenever I first started kind of looking into it, it wasn't a huge thing. I would say sports psychology has really gained a lot of traction since then, which is really exciting for me and really exciting for anybody that does this. But ever since I kind of figured that out, like, I'm really passionate about these two things. Like, let's blend them. I haven't really changed my mind since.
So what does it look like for the future of the industry now that professional sports have sports psychologists in their clubhouses and college athletic departments have entire teams of people who are just either CMPC certified or sports psychologists certified through some kind of clinical database? I mean, what does that mean for the industry to have those people in place where they should be?
Yeah. I think it's really exciting for me to see that mental health is being made a priority, and people are recognizing not only like the value in it, but like the true importance it has. Like, your mental is just as important as your physical. And I think like one of the most perfect examples was Simone Biles during the Olympics. Like, if your mental is not there, your physical might not be there either. Like, they go hand in hand, and they're so important and so crucial. And I think it's so exciting that nearly every professional sports team has this in some capacity. Many like major colleges, universities have this. And what I would hope to see is it starts to trickle down even further. So high schoolers are kind of getting this priority on their mental health, because I think the earlier you start teaching people about this, the earlier you can kind of make little kids in rec leagues aware, like, hey, this is important. And just like you can work out your muscles, you can work out your physical skills, like these mental skills, if you learn them early on, you keep practicing them, you keep building on them, it's just going to make you so much better, and it's going to put you in a lot healthier space. And I think that that's where I would really hope for to see this go, is just continue to trickle down. And just like strength and conditioning is so crucial and so important for athletes, I would like for mental health, for mental conditioning, to kind of have that hand in hand aspect.
When you look at youth sport and the youth sport to high school sport to potentially club or travel and then to college sport and then to professional sport, and you look at the trajectory of mental skills being taught and influenced by each life stage, where do you think that coaches should start talking about things like focus and time management? I mean, there's a huge emphasis in youth sport on teamwork and communication, but at what point should that switch to, okay, meditation and focus styles and implementing these mental skills that you hear kind of being reinforced in the later stages? Should they be earlier?
Yeah, I personally think so. I think people really underestimate children and they think, oh, like maybe this is like too over their head. Maybe they don't need this yet. Like they don't need to, their focus is fine, whatever, those kinds of things. I think we underestimate children. They're far more intelligent and willing to learn and grasp things. And they're just like sponges. If you tell them something, if you really try to work on these things with them throughout their life, they're going to be so good at it by the time they, let's say a kid makes it to the major leagues, by the time they get there, they're going to be like, oh, like I know focus. Now let me just fine tune it. So I think it's all in like the delivery for me. Like the way you deliver the messages is certainly going to be different. The way I would talk to a 10-year-old about focus, the way I would talk to a college student about focus would be incredibly different. But I think there's value in talking to both of them about it.
And then going off of that, how do the topics around mental skills change as you progress through those life stages? I mean, is it more like maintenance once you get to high school and college, or are you implementing different things at each of those stages?
I think it really depends. The way that I would approach it at this point in my life would probably be implementing different things. So, like a lot of people talk about, we've been on focus, but there are so many different aspects of focus and different like micro skills that you can work on within focus. So, introducing these like umbrella topics and kind of maybe getting a child acclimated to like, hey, this is what this is a beginner's way to kind of work on it, to kind of introduce you to this topic. The older you get, we can learn different skills and strategies and kind of different ways to implement it. And I say too, with mental skills, it's incredibly personal. Like what's going to work for somebody else to help their focus might not work for the next person. So not only just like fine tuning these skills, but figuring out what works for me and what is the best approach for me and kind of solidifying that as you get older.
Working off of that as well, how do the workshops that you're doing at Springfield differ based on being in a group setting versus being in an individual setting in the way that you present the information?
Yeah, so the the great thing about working in a group setting is you get to talk to everybody. You kind of like get to give everyone your spiel and kind of introduce this idea to everybody at the same time. But the downside of it is you might be talking about something that relates to this side of the room, and this side of the room is like, this doesn't work for me. Like, sorry. Um, so say we're doing a meditation workshop. Some people just don't like to meditate, and that's okay. But kind of giving people these options and kind of being like, all right, these are the skills that are at your disposal. And then once you get on that individualized level, being like, hey, did that work for you? No, okay, here's something else we can try. And kind of giving them these options. So I would say I really liked to utilize the group environment to kind of just like introduce them to ideas. And then at the end, giving like the plug, being like, hey, if that interested you, if that worked for you, if that didn't work for you, talk to your athletic counselor. They can give you more ideas. They can help you fine tune this skill. So that's kind of the way that I really liked to approach it because it's really, really hard to be specific to an athlete in a group setting. So kind of being general, introducing the ideas, and then kind of lasering in on it when you're with a person one-on-one.
Compare and contrast the job descriptions of an athletic counselor and a therapist.
Ooh, I think incredibly similar. I would say with athletic counseling, I talk to you about every aspect of your life. I have a specific emphasis on athletics and how these kinds of things, family, friends, school, filter into your athletics and kind of play into your identity as an athlete. Whereas with traditional therapy, it's more you as a whole person and obviously I'm interested in you as a whole person, but kind of this thread of like you as a whole person threading the athlete through all of that. With athletic counseling, I don't diagnose anybody, and once it gets super clinical, I would have to refer somebody else in. So we can kind of talk about like performance anxiety, but once it kind of gets to the point where I'm like, okay, this is something you should talk to a licensed counselor about. You kind of like refer somebody in and being like, hey, we're gonna bring somebody from the counseling center in, and you can still talk to me about this, but I just want you to know this person's here too, and this person can kind of give you more specific help for kind of the mental aspect of it. So I'm ultimately more interested and more focused on the performance and how all these aspects of your life play into your performance, whereas a traditional therapist is more just focused on kind of the mental health aspect and how that plays into all of the aspects of your life.
I really like that you called it the athlete thread, because if you think of your life as a quilt, that's only one part of it.
Yes.
How many athletes would you say that you deal with that have identity issues related to sport participation? I mean, is it a large degree of the people that you work with and for, or is that kind of on the back burner in terms of the issues that they're coming to you for?
I would say athlete identity is one of the number one things I talked about. So whether that was so Springfield College is a D3 college, so it's a little less intense than probably a D1 program would be. So these athletes were really trying to figure out, okay, I'm a college student and this is my career goal, this is my friend group. I also have to go to practice now and kind of figuring those things out. So I would say athlete identity was a huge part of what we talked about. And a lot of people really like to focus on this whenever they have athletes that are seniors. Like, okay, you're probably not going to be an athlete moving forward. Like, who are you? Like, let's figure it out. What are your interests outside of sport? Because while sport is so important and so fun and a huge chunk of who they are, it's not their entire being. So figuring out who are you outside of your sport and how can we help your sport play into that. So I would always talk to athletes about like transferable skills. So like, hey, you do this during gymnastics, like you work on this, you need this to help you perform better. How can that translate to your life? Like how can we work on teamwork? How can focus play into the classroom? How can all of these different aspects of sport that are really important to you, that are like a part of your identity, these things can kind of transfer into every part of your identity, and just making sure that athletes aren't like pigeonholing themselves into what they think they need to be. And that was just a lot of what we talked about, and like the transition out of sports or how to balance sports with the rest of my life. Because I think a lot of people view student athletes as just athletes, but like it's student athlete, like they're a student too, they're all these kinds of things, like you're not just one thing.
What are some questions that you asked those student athletes specifically who are dealing with identity issues to elicit a response from them? I mean, were there questions that going into sessions with them, you would say, okay, you're dealing with these identity issues, why? I mean, what were the questions that you were asking to start that dialogue with them?
Yeah, so I would really try to kind of figure out like what's your end game here. So like the miracle question is a really common question in therapy. It's like if you could like wave a magic wand in your life, it would be exactly how you wanted it to be. What would that look like? And then once you have that image of like, this is what I want my life to look like, it's like, okay, how do we get you there? Like what can we work on that's going to help you get to that point? Or a lot of the times I would talk to athletes about like, okay, other than a gymnast, other than a football player, like, who are you? What are you? Like, talk to me about you. Like, describe yourself. And I feel like that's such a hard question to answer. How many times have you been somewhere and they're like, "Oh, tell me about yourself." And you immediately just go like, "This is my job. This is where I went to school. This is all these kinds of things." And I'm like, "Okay, that's a start." But like, let's break it down further. Like, what do you like to do? What interests you? So kind of making them aware that like you're not just a football player, you're not just a soccer player. So having them identify those different parts of themselves and identify where do you want to be? Like what does your dream life look like? And how can we help you get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important question, especially when you're dealing with seniors who are not going to the major leagues or not going to a professional sport. Is that a big issue with the athletes that are graduating, or are they kind of coming to terms with it on their own?
I would say it depends on the person, truly. There are a lot of people that they were the star athlete on their team, but they're not pursuing a professional career. So now they're like, one, they have these giant chunks of time where they normally would have been at practice with their team, working out, all these different kinds of things. So figuring helping athletes figure out like, okay, you're gonna have like a lack of a routine now. Like, how do you want to fill your time? Like, that's a really big thing that people don't think about is like, oh, like I don't know how to work out on my own. Like I'm used to having all of these people just give me workouts and tell me what to do. So helping athletes kind of figure out how are you going to fill your time now? Like, you want to work out? Awesome. Like, let's keep that going. That makes you happy. That's part of your life. How are you going to do it? Are you going to join a class? Are you fine doing it on your own? And I would say a lot of the times too, athletes are so in the culture of being an athlete that once they're out of their sport, they're like, oh, like I always hung out with the team. Like now what am I going to do? So kind of helping them figure out how do you continue to foster relationships that are so crucial to your development as a human in your life. How do you continue to kind of build on that when you don't have practice to rely on, when you don't have games to rely on?
And then how did the work that you did at Springfield transition into the IMG internship?
Yeah, so I would say I used everything I learned at Springfield every second of the day. A lot of what I did at IMG was kind of these workshops that we've been talking about. So I would be with a group of soccer athletes talking about how do we handle pressure and kind of getting them introduced to these topics. So again, kind of like those big general things. For me in my program at Springfield, it was kind of just like a seamless transition because I was like, oh, this is what I've been doing. Like, this seemed so scary. And believe me, like the first couple weeks, it was terrifying. But once you're kind of into the groove, you're like, I've done this before. Like, I know what I'm doing. Kind of like that self pep talk of like, you don't know nothing. Like, you've done this before. So kind of those I would say the workshops and like the work that I did with athletes, like all of that hands-on work was so crucial and beneficial for me because otherwise I think I would have been thrown into this environment and been like, "Oh, I've never done this. Like I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I'm doing." Um, but thankfully, I had a really solid foundation to kind of bring me into that.
And this demographic was slightly younger than what you were used to working with. Did that make itself apparent
Yeah.
while you were down there?
Yes. So I worked at Springfield, I worked largely with the college students. I had a few different sites that I worked with children, but 90% of the time I was with college students. At IMG, I was working with kids ages 8 to 18, I would say the majority of the kids were probably in like the 10 to 14 range. So it was really, really different for me. And I would say the number one thing that like posed itself as a challenge for me specifically was just like classroom management and kind of being like, okay, how do I make this engaging? How do I make this interesting for them? Because it's way easier to get a 20-year-old to listen to you than it is to get a 10-year-old to listen to you. And it's kind of humbling too. Because if they think what you're saying is boring, like they're gonna let you know that what you're saying is boring. So you kind of had to figure out ways like, how do I make this entertaining? How do I make it fun? And how do I teach them something? But like fun being the number one thing. Because if it's not fun, they don't care.
And then how did you get hooked up with IMG in the first place? I mean, was
So
it like a seamless Springfield to IMG experience, or did you have to like go outside of the transition?
so I had to kind of go outside. I had spoken with Dr. Amber Selking. She works with Notre Dame football. And I had, like, the same way I reached out to Dr. Fader, I just emailed her and was like, hey, you do what I want to do. Can we talk on the phone? And I kind of really sold that, like, I worked for Notre Dame and I went to St. Mary's. So Notre Dame and St. Mary's are sister schools. So I think that really helped maybe get her attention a little bit more. And I had a long phone call with her, and she had worked at IMG. She had done this same exact internship. And she was like, I really think you should apply for this internship. It'd be really beneficial. I think you would learn a lot. So I kind of searched for it. It's like posted on LinkedIn. I forget how I like actually found the application, but it was kind of like an outside of Springfield thing, something that I applied for.
And then what did a day in your life at IMG entail? I mean, how many
Ooh,
athletes did you see on a daily basis?
good question. Um, let's see. I would do, depending on the day, about 4 sessions with athletes. Depending, we'll say like on average, the group size was like 15. So probably seeing, I don't know the quick math, like 60 athletes a day on average, kind of working individually, not individually, but like me with the group. So you would work with, who all did we work with? I'm like trying to recall now. We had tennis athletes, basketball, soccer, lacrosse, football, golf, tennis. I might have repeated one. But so we worked with all these different athletes, and you would have all of the athletes in the group would be of the same sport and of the same age. So you'd get there, you'd like set up all your stuff, and depending if you had the morning or the afternoon specialization. So a specialization was you were assigned a specific group of athletes and you would see them for 1 hour a day every week. And I usually did those in the afternoon, but we'll pretend I was doing it in the morning. So you'd get there, you'd set up all your stuff, and we were on like a 3-week rotation for curriculum. So we'll say we were talking about focus this week. And for 1 hour a day for the whole week, you would work with this group on focus and all the different aspects of focus. And they would hopefully leave with a lot of skills that they could start trying out. And then your other sessions would be like what we called core sessions. So every camper, because I worked with the camps specifically, every camper would get one core session per week. And that was also on like a 3-week rotation. So we did handling pressure, we did motivation and goal setting, and I forget the third one now, but so we would work specifically on one topic with them and kind of do like a one and done, an overview, introduction, like, hey, this is what this is. Here's one skill, like one tangible skill that you can take home and start practicing. And but kind of just like give them the idea like this is just scratching the surface. Like there's so many different things you can do with it. So the typical day, I would see a lot of kids do like 4 sessions. And if you're not like actively doing a session, you're either preparing for the session, because it was either like a PowerPoint presentation, and I always tried to add like a little activity during the PowerPoint presentation because, like I said, fun is like the number one thing. How can I keep them engaged? Or if it was an outdoor session, you were doing kind of all activities with them. So you were either preparing for a session or you were like bouncing ideas off of people. Because we were on a 3-week rotation for curriculum, you would be doing the same thing every 3rd week, but you'd be like, okay, how can I like do this a little bit differently? Or this didn't really go great last time. How can I change it? Like, how can I make it better? So I would say it was a really fun environment to be creative in and kind of figure things out because, like I said earlier, the way you're going to deliver information to a group of 10-year-olds is not going to be the same way that you try to deliver information to a group of 18-year-olds. So kind of like knowing their age groups was really beneficial too, and being like, okay, like I think that if I did this with this group, they would really like that, or this with this one, like maybe steer clear of that.
Were
So
there
with this,
any, were there, oh, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, were there any anecdotes from your time at IMG where you saw breakthroughs as well?
Yeah, so there was one day, it was again like such an exciting day. Like I'll probably never forget this. I was talking to a group of basketball athletes. I think they were 17 because the athlete that I spoke to after the session was looking at colleges. And I was talking to them about confidence and the way, like, this, the skill that I was teaching with confidence was self talk. And I always like to throw out the statistic that you have on average 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. And then I would ask them, how many of those thoughts do you think you were truly aware of? Like, how many of them you're like, yep, I got that one. That's a thought that I was aware of. And the answer is usually not 60 to 80,000. So then we kind of talked about how you a lot of the times have thoughts that you're not aware of, but are unhelpful to you and are unhelpful to your confidence. So kind of the message I was trying to deliver was you have to be aware of what you're saying to yourself. And that's the first step to like improving your self talk or improving your confidence, is just like that awareness level of, all right, like this is how I'm feeling when I'm not playing well, or this is what I'm saying to myself when I don't feel super confident. So I was really trying to like drive home that message of like, you have to be aware of what you're saying to yourself. And after the session, an athlete came up to me and he was like, how many times a day do you do this? And I was like 3 or 4, 5, I'm like not sure. And he said, I always thought that I wanted to go into finance in college, but I think I want to do sports psychology now. Like this was really interesting. And I was like, oh, really? Um, so that was really exciting for me. And then he was like, where did you go to school? Like, what did you do? How do I do this? And then he had kind of told me, he was like, it sounds really silly, but whenever you said to be aware of your thoughts, like I've never thought about that. He was like, it makes sense, but that's just like not something I've ever considered. He was like, I'm going to do that. That sounds helpful. And just the fact that he was like interested enough to talk to me, because obviously I'm always like, if you have any questions, let me know. But they're like, we have to go to lunch. Like we're good. But I was just so exciting that he was like, yeah, like I liked this. I think this is helpful. And I hope he majors in sports psychology now.
That's great. So, what is the future for you? I mean, you finished the IMG internship. What are you doing now?
Yeah, so right now I am back home in West Virginia and I'm kind of taking a year off. I really want to pursue my PhD in sports psychology. So while I'm home, I'm really looking forward to working with some like local high school teams because like I was saying, not many high school teams outside of IMG have mental conditioning. So just kind of like trying to work locally and being like, hey, like this is something you should be aware of. Like this is something that we can start talking about. So that's what I'm really hoping to do in the next year. I'm also really hoping to get my master's thesis published. So working on publication, which is quite the process. But my ultimate goal is hopefully to pursue a PhD in sports psychology because I feel as though right now I have a really solid base for being in the sports psychology field. I have a really great counseling background. But there's, I feel like so many things I still want to learn and I still want to know, especially along the like the more sports science side, since my master's program was really emphasized in counseling. I feel like there's some things that I still want to learn about the performance aspect of sports psychology.
So I'm going to back you up a couple steps in that response and ask you what the reception from these high school teams is to you as an outsider coming in and suggesting sports psychology assistance for their teams.
Yeah, so I think lucky for me, it's becoming way more prevalent and way more well known than maybe it would have been 10 years ago. So a lot of the times when I'm talking to these high school athletes, this isn't a foreign concept to them. It also really helps that a lot of professional teams have sports psychologists, so that kind of makes it an easier sell because buy-in is such a hard thing to get and such a hard thing to kind of push. And since I'm from the area, since I played sports in this area, a lot of the coaches already know me, so it's easier to kind of sell to them, be like, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'd love to talk to some of your athletes about it, kind of like make them aware. And so it's typically really good, which is really exciting for me and I think really promising for like anybody that wants to do this. Um, that I think the trickle down from professional sports to college sports is kind of a helpful sell for high school athletes. And also, like my high school, we didn't even have an athletic trainer, let alone a sports psychologist or an athletic counselor. So I think, especially in small places like West Virginia, where there aren't tons of resources for high school athletes, it's just nice for them to be like, hey, like this is something cool that we can do, that we can learn about. Whether they take a lot from it, I would have to ask them individually. I hope they take a lot from it. But I think it's just nice to kind of be like, hey, like I'm somebody that cares about how you're performing. I'm somebody that cares about how you're doing and kind of just like making them feel like they're important and what they're doing is important because I think a lot of times and I think especially in West Virginia schools there's not tons of resources, so being like, hey, I'm a resource, you can use me. um so the reception's usually pretty good.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, I was talking to, at the very beginning of this podcast, I had a couple people on who were working with youth sports specifically and had been for years. And they were just talking about how the reception of them just being around the athletes and giving to these schools and also just rec sport leagues their services had totally flipped, and how different it felt to feel appreciated among these 10 to 12-year-olds and their parents who finally were
Mhm.
like, yeah, this is kind of something that we may need.
Yeah, I think like I know if I were a high school athlete and I had a sports psychologist at my disposal, I would feel so special. I would feel so excited. And whether they utilize you or not, just kind of knowing that there's that additional resource there for them, I think is really important, especially in the mental health aspect. There's only like so many people, like high school guidance counselors are incredible, but typically really understaffed. And there's not a lot to go around, and they're doing the work of a lot of people. So whenever you have somebody come in and you're like, hey, like I'm specifically here for sports, like I'm here to help you with your sports. And that's something that's so important to high school athletes. Like that's a huge part. If you want to talk about identity, high school athletes, like that's a huge part of their identity, playing that high school sport. And a lot of them, like that's where it's going to end for them. So making sure that they have these resources available to them as much as they can, and hopefully the industry grows a lot more and that's going to be more readily available.
Is there anything else that you think that I missed about you, about your story, about your place in the athlete mental health industry? Anything else that you have upcoming, certifications that you're about to get or are looking toward getting? Anything
Yeah.
else that you think this podcast would benefit by knowing?
Good question.
As we
I
as
would
we wrap this
say,
up.
yeah, I would say one thing that is really important to me and something I really try to emphasize in my practice and like my learning and my research especially is gender and how that kind of plays into athletics. We talked a little bit about how like I approach working with men versus working with women. Um, but like my research interests specifically are in feminist sports psychology and how it's not super talked about, unfortunately. But kind of how if we have more cultural awareness and research lens to practice, right? So like the more research that we're doing on, hey, like these are the best coaching practices for women, these are the best coaching practices for men. This is how being a woman alters the experience of being an athlete, or being a minority alters the experience of being an athlete. That's something that's really important to me. And unfortunately, I don't like have tons of research to give you about it at the moment, but I think that's something that I hope is kind of figuring out how the identity of athlete intersects with the identity of being a woman, with being a different kind of minority. So I think that's something that is very important to me that I kind of emphasize.
Of course. I mean, I think that we could sit here and talk for 3 hours about that.
I know.
Especially now because you have athletes like Simone Biles who's coming out about her mental health specifically, but then you also have athletes like Alex Morgan and Sydney Leroux who have children and bring their children to soccer games. And then you have Serena Williams who had a child and is back playing tennis and crushing at it. So it's no
Hmm.
longer like, okay, your career is over now that you're a mom, or you have to be less of something or more of something because you're a woman in sport. I mean, I think that that's a really important piece of the athlete landscape now that we have these, I hesitate to say role models because they're not necessarily role models for anything other than an engaged, I mean, like an advanced landscape.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so exciting for me that you don't have to be a specific thing anymore. Like just going along with identity, like you can have all of these different identities that lend in to being an athlete. And I think it's really exciting that it's changing. Like you're not in this specific kind of role. You don't have to be. And your different identities like don't take away from you being an athlete, like they enhance that. And people can kind of look up to that and kind of be like, oh, like I don't have to be a certain thing. Like I can just play a sport and I can try to perform the best that I can and see how these different identities impact that and can help improve that as well. And I think the more like clinicians are aware of that, the more they are aware of like how these different identities intersect, they're going to be better able to help athletes. And I think that's something that I would hope would start to be really emphasized and really looked at. Because like an athlete's not just an athlete, they're a whole person. And understanding those different identities is so crucial into helping that athlete perform.
And especially when you have situations, and I use that term loosely, like the NCAA's handling of the women's basketball national championship strength and conditioning room, and then you have what just happened. I think last night the WNBA got, I think it was either a game or some kind of tournament that was moved because Disney on Ice was performing in their arena. And so they had to
Mhm.
totally relocate the game. How many of those scenarios where women are either obviously or like low key the target have to
Yeah.
happen before something changes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as unfortunate as like the NCAA tournament specifically was, I thought it was encouraging that so many people were taking note because like newsflash, it's been like this forever. But this was, it felt like to me at least, the first time that people were like kind of being like, hey, wait a second, like why is it like that for them? But the guys get all of this kind of stuff. They're especially for like the NCAA women, like they're getting similar for softball specifically. They're getting similar viewerships. Like, so that wasn't a good argument that you could maybe use for basketball. Again, not an excuse at all, but like that's an argument that's thrown out. But I remember for the NCAA softball tournament, I was like, that's not even an argument you can use in this instance, as they're getting similar viewership, they're bringing in similar numbers. Um, so I think the more awareness is way more encouraging, and I think the more people kind of start to call that out, and people are, I think, misled if they think that those things aren't impacting the way that female athletes play. Like if they don't feel as like what's the word I'm looking for? They don't feel as valued as their male counterparts. That's going to impact how they're playing and also going to impact how they feel about themselves. So I think that the more aware we are of that and the more we try to kind of combat those situations, the better off our female athletes are going to be.
Oh my gosh, I just saw this. I think it was the National Women's Soccer League Rookie of the Year last season. She won Rookie of the Year and they gave her a $50 Chipotle gift card. And that was it. That was her. Congratulations, you're the rookie of the entire year. Here's $50 worth of Chipotle. And she just came out like maybe a week ago and she was like, this is so weird. Like why is this the norm?
Yeah, and what does that say about the way we treat women in our society? Especially, I think the biggest case of that is the way that the US women's national team is compensated. And like,
Once again, we
come
could
on.
talk about this for 3 hours
Yeah,
as well.
we could. But whenever you have young athletes looking at that and being like, those are some of the best soccer players in the world, and they're not getting treated fairly, like, what shot do I have? So I think the more we understand the way that's impacting female athletes, the better we're going to be able to serve them. Because maybe I can't change the pay structure of the women's national team, but I can understand the way that's impacting maybe the self confidence of a 15-year-old soccer player. And I think the more we pay attention to that and the more we start to look into that, the more we're going to be able to help. Because I would say confidence is one of the biggest issues with female athletes. And I think we're crazy if we think that those kinds of things don't in some kind of fashion play into the confidence of those athletes, because if they see that society does not value them equally and or is not compensating them equally or giving them fair treatment, they're going to internalize that to a certain extent, and that's going to impact their performance. Like every part of this impacts performance, and I think that's something that people miss sometimes.
Oh, it's gonna be a great interview. I'm so happy that I had you on.
Yeah, it's been really fun. It's so
Yay.
nice to kind of like my parents are probably sick of hearing me like give these spiels, so it's nice to tell somebody new.
Oh my gosh, I'll like Zoom you every week if you just want to talk about
Yeah.
this. So I believe that your podcast episode will come out in 2 weeks. So that would be 2 weeks from today is September 3rd or October 13th.
Oh, cool.
So if you can just either email me or DM me a picture that I could use for social media, that would be great. And then I will talk to you right before this podcast goes live and then the day of as well.
Perfect.
Awesome. And is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Anything that you wanted me to leave out of the interview that we talked about? Anything that you did
Um,
not want published?
not that I can think
Okay,
of.
great. The answer is normally no.
I tried to be very general about
Yeah,
the athlete. That's like
yeah.
the only thing I would say, but I was trying to be very
No,
general.
I caught in your anecdotes how you never specified gender.
Okay,
And
good. 'Cause the
yeah,
whole time I was gonna say,
yeah, I mean, I think that there is a line that with this podcast, I do have to be careful that I don't cross. Because when I do ask for anecdotes, some people are like, "Oh my gosh, this person played this sport and graduated in this year and does this," and I'm like, "Oh, can't.
yeah, I
That's
think that's like,
a little too intrusive." So I always ask that just at the end in case there was something that you just kind of slipped out that you thought, "Oh my gosh, I can't say that."
yeah, no, I think that's like the counselor brain being like generalities always.
All right, and if there's nothing else that you wanted to add, I'm going to conclude this recording and I will talk to you in 2 weeks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for asking.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.